Okay, now let's get back to bringing fiscal policy into the picture. Now, the objectives of fiscal policy are really quite diffuse. In the United States, and I think most other countries, it's largely politically driven. There are some countries, New Zealand, Sweden, for example, that specify the objective of ensuring that fiscal policy is sustainable, or that they're trying to do something with income distribution or to maximize economic growth. But at a minimum, fiscal policy has to ensure that government debt is risk-free. Now, we ran into this problem in the United States recently with the dysfunctionality in Washington, but I think we can all agree that this is sort of a minimal requirement of fiscal policy. So risk-free means that government debt doesn't grow to a point where investors begin to doubt that the government will pay off the debt. And as we know, this has happened in several European countries in the past several years. Now, if we're going to integrate monetary and fiscal policy, we're going to have to expand government budget constraints beyond what we've done so far. So let's introduce some notation. B with a T superscript is total debt. B with an F superscript is just the debt that's held by the Fed. So the difference between them is going to be the debt that is held by the public. And here we're not differentiating between whether the public is domestic or foreign. Now, S is going to be seigniorage payments by the Fed to the Treasury. So when the Fed generates revenue through seigniorage, which is the inflation tax, as you'll see in a minute, then the Fed ultimately returns this revenue to the Treasury. I should say as an aside that the Money and Prices Part 2 segment on hyperinflations spends a fair amount of time talking about seigniorage. Then T minus G is total revenue less, we'll say this is less total spending, and that's the real primary budget surplus. R is going to be the net nominal interest rate on debt. So this is debt that's sold at time t. Remember, it's nominal. Pays a nominal interest rate of RT at time t plus 1. And then M is going to be high-powered money, which is currency plus reserves. And just remember that because money and debt are both denominated in dollars, they have a common goods price of 1 over P. Now, the Treasury and the Fed have distinct budget constraints. So on the left-hand side here for the Treasury is total debt that they sell. And that has to be equal to, well, they've got to finance the old debt, right? So this is the principal plus the interest on debt that they sold in the previous period. Then if there's any deficit, that is the, if taxes are less than government spending, then this whole thing is going to be positive, and they're going to have to raise more, they're going to have to sell more debt. But the seigniorage revenue that they get, so this is from the inflation tax, the seigniorage revenue that they get from the Fed serves to reduce the amount of debt that they have to issue. Now, the Fed, they hold some Treasury bonds, and at the same time they have some seigniorage. Here they collect the interest on the Treasury bonds that they held in the previous period, and then this is the change in high-powered money. So this is delta M. Now, if we want to treat the government as a single entity, we can combine these two budget constraints. And essentially what we want to get then is this, remember, is debt that's held by the public. And you get that by just subtracting the second equation from the first equation. So now we have that the amount of debt held by the public is going to depend on how much debt they had in the previous period. It's going to depend on what's happening to the budget surplus, and it depends on what's happening to the growth rate of the money supply, or the change in the money supply. So seigniorage revenue doesn't appear here, and the reason for that is that it's just a transfer within the government, and therefore it nets out once we go to this consolidated budget constraint. Now there are two kinds of inflation tax. One is if the inflation is fully anticipated, and the second is if it's unanticipated. So suppose initially that all inflation is fully anticipated. And in this case, we can just write the Fisher equation in this way. So this is the real interest rate equals the nominal rate divided by, this is the actual inflation rate. So normally we would have expected inflation, but we're pretending that it's all fully anticipated. So expected inflation is actual inflation. Then we can write the debt held by the public in real terms. We just take the nominal debt divided by P. Do the same thing for high-powered money. Take nominal money divided by the price level. And then we can take this consolidated budget constraint here and just divide through by P. And what that will do is it'll convert it into real terms. So now we have that real debt held by the public depends on the real interest rate, as well as how much debt was held by the public before. This is the real primary surplus, and this is going to be the real value of the change in money growth. And this is what is called the inflation tax. So if inflation is fully anticipated, then the real interest rate is just going to adjust 1 for 1 with, actually I should say this is a mistake. It is that the nominal interest rate adjusts 1 for 1 with inflation. So inflation goes up by 1%, the nominal interest rate goes up by 1%, and the real interest rate doesn't change at all. Now this can be written just as delta M over P, and this is the anticipated inflation tax. Okay? Now, of course, in practice, people never know exactly what's going to happen in the future, and so there's always some unanticipated inflation. And when you have unanticipated inflation, then this inflation tax looks very different. So to see this, what we're going to do is we're going to write this equation in a slightly different form, just to make explicit where the current P shows up. Okay? Now, at time t minus 1, when people are buying these bonds from the government, they form an expectation about what the price level is going to be at time t. And the reason for that is because they want to form an expectation of what the inflation rate is going to be at time t. So 1 plus the inflation rate is PET divided by PT minus 1. Once they have a view about the price level and therefore the inflation rate, then we have the ex-ante real interest rate. Now, if inflation is surprisingly high, then the price level comes in above what people expected, and the real interest rate ends up being less than people expected. So think about what that means. If inflation is surprisingly high, then the people who were lending to the government and lending expecting that they would get people were lending expecting that they would get a real return of RET, but they end up getting a return that's less than RET. So the government actually makes out pretty well when you have surprisingly high inflation. And that is the unanticipated inflation tax. And that shows up in the budget constraint as this first term, which I've rewritten down here. And basically what's going on is if PT jumps, then this whole thing declines. So the real amount of debt that the government has to finance falls because of the surprise increase in the price level. Now, in advanced economies, the amount of government debt that's outstanding is a whole lot higher than the amount of high-powered money. And therefore, this unanticipated tax is potentially quite important. Okay, so to summarize this, the anticipated tax arises because money doesn't pay any interest. And therefore, any positive inflation, whether it's anticipated or unanticipated, reduces the value of money and it generates seigniorage revenue. But this is not the case with government bonds. They pay a nominal interest rate that is linked to the expected inflation rate. And so if inflation is fully anticipated, then it's just going to get built into the nominal interest rate, which then allows the real rate of return on bonds to be protected. On the other hand, if inflation is unanticipated, then the only way to get an inflation tax on the other hand, the only way to actually get an inflation tax that applies to interest-bearing bonds is if the inflation is unanticipated. And the reason for that is that surprisingly high inflation reduces the ex post real return, which is like raising the tax rate. Okay, so remember that the M that we're talking about is high-powered money, which is currency plus reserves. The B is nominal debt held by the public. If we look at the United States, B over M, the ratio, was about 4.4 in November of 2012. But this is a lot smaller than it normally is because we had that explosion in the quantity of bank reserves and therefore in the high-powered money. So more normally, if you were to take away that explosion in the Fed's balance sheet, the ratio of bonds to money is about 11.5. So using the values of bonds and money that are out there in 2011, 2012, we had 11.5 trillion in bonds, we had 1 trillion in money. So if you have a 1% surprise inflation, that reduces the value of debt by 1.1 billion. But it only reduces the value of money by 9.9 million. So surprise inflation is potentially very important. And empirical work that has been done confirms this, that surprise changes in inflation have played a very important role in reducing the value of government debt historically in the United States.